Hey guys, what's up? Today this is the third challenge for the Showstopper. The challenge is to make a biscuit board game. The game must be at least 40 centimeters in diameter. It needs at least 8 elements. The biscuits can be any flavor or any type, but the main thing is you must be able to play your board game and then eat your board game. This is something that has not been seen in the Bake Off before. They must develop an eye for detail when making their biscuit game pieces. Paul says you have to be a designer, you have to be artistic to really highly decorate the biscuits. Prue explains that board games are all about the detail. It has to be very neat, the colours must be sharp-edged, the writing must be legible. Paul says you can create the most amazing board game in the world, but actually it has to taste good. This is the Great British Bake Off, after all. Stacey explains that she has to get 3 doughs done within a half an hour, otherwise the game won't be complete. Liam says ideally he's aiming to get all his baking done within the first 2 hours, so he has 1 hour for decorating. Sophie is making a Snakes and Ladders game, but it requires 50 individual dark chocolate biscuit squares and another 50 flavoured with lemon zest and bergamot oil. Paul asks, have you done this before? Sophie replies, sort of. She explains, I haven't done this beginning to end. The Snakes and Ladders will be made from royal icing. They move on to Tom. He is making a drains, pipes and ladders. So it's the plumber's version of Snakes and Ladders. It's going to be made using a cinnamon and nutmeg board covered in fondant with peppermint fondant playing pieces. They move on to James and his Coppet game. The board is made from spiced orange, chocolate and ginger shortbread. He will colour more spiced dough for his playing pieces. He explains that originally it was a board game owned by his wife, and that she'd been playing since she was 4, and now it's become a family game. We now move on to Stacey. Her game board is based off of the school run with her children. Players have to move around a chocolate-covered board to win a star biscuit. These use her son's favourite flavours of cocoa powder, freeze-dried strawberries, and vanilla pop. They move on to Kate and her jungle game. She's going to use a special type of ancient spice called Grains of Paradise, with orange-flavoured monkeys and cardamom-flavoured playing counters. This is based off a film that was her favourite when she was very young, called Jumanji. Paul says that the flavours work with the board, but will Kate have the time to decorate? Kate looks ominously and thinks, yes, I might be able to. They move on to Flo, who is making a Pick My Bones game. An almond biscuit patient will lie on a vanilla biscuit operating table, and everything will be covered in coloured fondant. They mention the bakers will have to ensure their timing is on point, as they have various pieces that need to be completed. They move on to Julia. She is making a British baking game, a ginger and lime board with chocolate and orange liqueur, stepping stones, and ginger pieces. Whoever lands on the most Star Baker biscuits is considered the winner. Julia says that by making her own game, she is demonstrating that she can be creative and original. But from the initial looks of the design, it looks very simplistic, as though a 7-year-old has created it. We'll see later on how they deal with this and what the judges criticise about it. They then move on to Jan's Adventures in Bakeland game. It's going to be lemon and matcha tea with cardamom biscuit squares. As you can see, she is the second person to create a baking game. Therefore, Julia's plan to be the original only one to do so has now gone out the window. They then move on to Liam. He is designing a multifunctional board game, including checkers, snakes and ladders, noughts and crosses. Paul asks, how many pieces are you going to make? He has called it his classroom classics game, which will be made from a chocolate orange blackboard and individual playing pieces made from lemon, honey and ginger. He says that the combination was always something he would be given when he was ill by his grandmother, one of those traditional remedies, but he dodges Paul's question and says it's just going to be a lot, and starts laughing. They move on to Chris. He is making biscuits to represent the different parts of the country. He is calling it the Great British Sail-Off. The board is made from orange zest and cardamom, and the pieces will be made from ground ginger. Paul says that Chris is trying to make a big board game, and he is trying to create a lot of shapes. He asks whether Chris has made it before. Chris replies, not in 3.5 hours. He says, more likely I will need nearer 6. So he also hints to them to say, well, if the judges stop talking to me, then perhaps I can get on. I find this to be quite rude, but I suppose he should have planned better, or created something different if he'd had the time, as you will see later on. They then move on to Stephen and his check bake game. He is making a coffee gingerbread chess set complete with a Union Jack coloured orange and spice biscuit board. He says to the judges that he has to make 100 individual pieces. Out of all the contestants, he is therefore making the largest number of pieces. Whether this will work for or against him is yet to be seen. At this stage, most of the bakers are taking out their pieces slowly, but it's seen that Flo has broken her entire board and says she hopes to rectify it by adding icing to the sides to stick it back together. At the 1 hour mark, they're starting to decorate and arrange their boards. Tom has set up small templates, as you can see, to prevent the edible spray from going everywhere and to focus the spray in the particular areas he wants. At the half-hour point, Kate has decided she does not have the time to complete her decorations and tries her best to do what she can. Sophie also admits to being behind. At the 5 minutes stage, chaos ensues. Sophie is still decorating her dice. During the last few minutes, Kate is also seen to be decorating the jungle landscape and has therefore given up on further decorating of her individual pieces. Now for the judgment. Sophie has brought along her Snakes and Ladders game. Prue says it is beautifully neat. She hasn't had to ice the whole thing, therefore it's saved her time. Paul says the blocks all look equal and the dice look very good. He loves the lemon flavour and the bergamot he gets at the end, but it works. A biscuit that cracks, he thinks she has done a very good job. We move on to Tom's Drainpipes and Ladders game. Prue says she loves the colours, bright as anything, very neat. She says it's very spicy and Christmassy. Paul says it's soft for a biscuit, it's too soft for him, but the overall design is very good, a typical architect type of work. They move on to Julia's A British Baking Game. Prue says the overall game is a little disappointing. Paul says the biscuits are delicious. He says not much ginger, but he gets a lot of lime. This then follows on to Jan's Adventures in Bakeland game. Jan explains that you make your way around the board towards Noel and Sandy. Paul says it's a shame that the biscuits are separated, as it means you have just made a lot of different biscuits. Though he likes the piping, Prue says the lemony ones are nice. Paul says the biscuits have been overworked, making them rubbery, though he says he does taste the matcha tea. They move on to James' Coppet game. Prue says she loves the colours. They are her type of colours. They are bang in your face. Paul says the cones have sort of worked, but every time he moves one piece gets removed. He asks, is that part of the game? Prue says the texture is nice to eat. Paul says the chocolate melts in your mouth and the flavours are very good, and the actual board game is a nice idea. They move on to Flow, and Prue says that it looks sprightly, but it is a bit of a mess, adding fondant unnecessarily. Both judges say that there is not much difference between the two flavours of the almond and the vanilla. They are both great biscuits. They are crumbly, simplistic, but does the... They move on to Chris with The Great British Sail-Off game. The board is a bit rough and ready. Prue says the little boats are quite neat. When Paul cuts the biscuit at the top, Noel jokes that's Scotland leaving England. Prue says, do you want your own teeth? Paul says the biscuits are burnt. The flavours are okay. Prue says the most impressive thing about your design is your compass. Chris jokes, well, I've never heard that before. I don't, personally, from my standpoint, don't like the aspect of the whiskey on the side. It looks like some sort of, drunken bribe. Here, drink this. Now make sure I win. I know it's just to prove the point that that's inside the biscuit, but it does look a bit deceptive. They then look at Kate's jungle game. Paul says it looks messy. Prue says it looks a bit more like a jungle swamp rather than a pure jungle. Paul says he cannot taste the grains of paradise, and Prue says the biscuit is a bit solid. It would not be a pleasure to eat. That's just a polite way of saying it's just burnt and too hard. They then move on to Liam's Classroom Classics game. Paul says it looks a bit unfinished, because once the board was done, Liam spent the rest of his time cutting out shapes that could have been decorated a bit more. Paul says they are fantastic flavours. Prue says that it's absolutely delicious. Paul says he would like to have seen a lot more decoration, considering the time he had left. They move on to Stephen's game board. Paul says it looks exceptional. The work that he has done to the top is sublime and very delicate. Prue says it's a masterpiece. Paul says it is a great bake. He says it's very clever. The last baker to be judged is Stacey, with her own school trip cake biscuit board. So they say it's so neat and so beautiful. The piping of the little school blazer, you can see at the top of the corner, is just spectacular. Paul says it's slightly chewy, quite rubbery, and not much flavour. The chocolate is bone dry, the texture is all wrong, and has crumbled into nothing. The judges and the presenters then proceed over to their own special area to discuss the good and the bad. Prue says she loved the challenge as there was great variety. Paul mentions Steve as a strong game board, and Prue says that Tom's design was good. Paul says this applies to Sophie as well, as the taste of the biscuits were, in his words, divine. On the other hand, Chris did not complete his board. Stacey's looked good, but the biscuits were bone dry. Kate struggled to complete her bake. Flo didn't do well. Paul says it is not as clean-cut as you think. There are more of them down at the bottom. There is going to be more of a discussion around them than the Star Baker. And the winner of Star Baker is... Yes, it's Stephen for the second time in a row. The loser is then announced to be Chris. He says it's a shame he didn't get to make bread or pastries, as those were his strong points. Paul says everything fell to pieces for him. It's a shame, as he has some fantastic ideas. Prue says everyone will miss Chris. It is one of the saddest things to see someone leave. In my personal opinion, Chris did deserve to leave. He has been weak in 2 weeks running, with either raw, in part, dishes almost completely undone, as in you've put them in there for 2 minutes, and that has caused him to be in this position. He was weak on both points, only edging Peter by his flavours just slightly. I don't necessarily believe that Stephen deserved the Star Baker accolade 2 weeks in a row. It wasn't for the simple fact that he was great. It was actually more to the fact that the others had been quite mediocre and inconsistent in some respects. If you look at someone like Yan, who ended up getting first in the technical challenge, I think she was a more deserving winner for Star Baker, as she'd been consistent for the rest of the bakes this week. And also, she just generally knew what she was doing right then and there. She made enough of an advancement to probably warrant the Star Baker accolade. In contrast, I think Stephen has just managed, because he did as much as he did for the showstopper at the end, that very much clicked into the judges' brains, and therefore from that it was almost like he was guaranteed, if he could get it right, he was guaranteed the Star Baker award. It would be incredibly annoying if they were to permit him in the third episode to have the Star Baker again, as I don't believe anyone necessarily deserves it, especially 3 weeks in a row. Three times within the whole competition is fine, because there might be weeks where you're really good, but to have it 3 times in a row, no, I can't accept that. So, what do you guys think of this third showstopper? Did you think it was what you expected? Did you like the designs of the various game boards? Whose was your favourite? Who did you least like? What would you have made if you'd been in their situation? And as always, leave your comments down below. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it. Please click the bell for notifications. Please subscribe. And thank you for taking the time to watch. And